In 1346, Kaffa, a major Black Sea trading port on the Crimean Peninsula, was besieged by Janibeg Khan of the Golden Horde, a division of the Mongol Empire. A devastating bubonic plague broke out on a large scale among Mongol troops stationed outside the city walls. Mongol siege engineers catapulted corpses of plague victims over the stone fortifications and into Kaffa, triggering an uncontrollable outbreak inside the port city. In the winter of 1347, surviving Genoese merchant ships fled the doomed settlement and docked at Messina in Sicily, marking the official arrival of the Black Death in Western Europe. Spreading along Eurasian postal relay routes and Silk Road overland trade paths, as well as maritime shipping lanes built and secured by the Mongol Empire over a century of expansion, the plague swept across all of Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing 30 to 60% of the continent's total population. This plague that trailed the territorial expansion of the Mongol Empire was never merely a natural epidemic. It acted as a piercing mirror that laid bare all deep-rooted ailments and fractures hidden beneath medieval Europe's established social order. It was never the bacteria alone that claimed tens of millions of lives. Far more destructive were rigid class divisions, collapsing religious credibility, ineffective urban governance, unbalanced economic structures, indifferent ruling systems, and human cruelty bred by widespread mass panic. The Yersinia pestis bacterium had long resided naturally within marmot populations inhabiting mountain grasslands in Central Asia. Blocked by mountains, deserts, and fragmented tribal trade networks, the pathogen had been prevented from large-scale outward transmission for centuries. After unifying steppe tribes, the Mongol Empire constructed a vast yam postal and relay network spanning Eurasia, setting up supply stations and armed escorts every few dozen miles. This system drastically accelerated cross-continental military movement, as well as commercial exchange and diplomatic correspondence, completely dismantling the natural geographical barriers that had contained the plague. As early as the 1320s, scattered plague cases emerged along the modern border between Xinjiang and Kyrgyzstan. Lacking centralized epidemic monitoring and mandatory case reporting, Mongol authorities took no targeted containment measures. Rodents carrying the pathogen stowed away inside trade cargo, as well as herders' belongings and military supply wagons, traveling west along imperial trade arteries all the way to the Black Sea coast, until Kaffa's siege created the critical turning point for intercontinental spread. After the plague entered Europe, the feudal serf system that had sustained social order for centuries crumbled first. Under the old hierarchy, serfs were legally bound to aristocratic manorial land, with no right to relocate or demand higher wages. Labor surplus left the lower class with no negotiating power whatsoever. Mass depopulation caused vast stretches of farmland to lie untended, while manors lost their entire workforce. Surviving laborers abandoned their hereditary estates to seek higher-paid employment in towns, at wages 5 or 6 times higher than before. In 1351, the English crown issued the Ordinance of Laborers to suppress wage hikes and preserve the old exploitative hierarchy, sharply intensifying public grievances and class conflict. The peasants' revolt led by Wat Tyler erupted across England in 1381, targeting serfdom, unfair poll taxes, and hereditary noble privileges. Though the uprising was suppressed by military force, the ancient order of land annexation and personal bondage could never again be fully restored. Many noble families were forced to sell inherited land, tenant farming and paid labor gradually became mainstream, the feudal system disintegrated step by step, and fertile ground was created for the germination of capitalism and the rise of the urban middle class. The Roman Catholic Church, supreme spiritual authority in Western Europe, suffered an irreversible collapse of public trust. Medieval doctrine framed illness and death as divine punishment for sin, and priests were believed capable of warding off disaster through prayer, confession, and last rites. Yet clergy members had no basic awareness of disease transmission or sanitary protection, as their pastoral duties required them to enter infected households and handle the bodies of the deceased. More than 30% of parish priests and high-ranking bishops perished during the initial waves of the pandemic. Witnessing devout religious figures dying alongside ordinary people, countless believers lost faith in religious rituals as a reliable shield against death. Groups of flagellants emerged across Germany, France, and Italy. These groups separated themselves from official church jurisdiction and atoned for humanity's sins through public self-flagellation. To channel widespread terror and social frustration, marginalized Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning water sources in order to deliberately spread the plague. Local municipal authorities permitted and even organized mass arrests, torture, and burnings. While the Vatican issued papal edicts condemning such violence, it failed to restrain local authorities from scapegoating vulnerable minorities to shift institutional blame. Recurring plague outbreaks deepened public skepticism toward clerical corruption and the purchase of church offices, laying the ideological foundation for Europe's Protestant Reformation centuries later. Severe flaws in urban living conditions and primitive public health infrastructure were fully exposed amid the crisis. Medieval European cities were filled with piles of rotting garbage. Residents dumped domestic waste directly from upper-story windows onto pedestrian streets, while drinking wells were placed adjacent to livestock pens and refuse heaps. Fleas and rats thrived in these filthy surroundings, establishing persistent local transmission chains independent of imported cases. Medieval physicians adhered strictly to the ancient theory of humoral imbalance, relying on bloodletting and herbal remedies with no effective treatment for bubonic plague. Church-run hospices mixed contagious patients with non-infectious cases, leading to rampant cross-contamination between the sick. Following successive catastrophic outbreaks, the Republic of Ragusa introduced the world's first formal maritime quarantine regulation in 1377, mandating that all ships arriving from plague-stricken regions anchor offshore and wait 40 days before allowing crew and passengers to land. Venice, Milan, and Florence subsequently established permanent municipal health boards responsible for screening incoming travelers and locking down infected neighborhoods, cleaning public water supplies, tallying plague fatalities, and carrying out broad urban sanitation. Milan adopted the strictest containment policy by walling off entire blocks once a single case was confirmed and drastically cutting local mortality rates. These emergency anti-epidemic measures evolved into permanent public health frameworks, forming the institutional origin of modern global bodies, including the World Health Organization and national disease control centers. The epidemic permanently restructured economic patterns across Eurasia. Fear of contagion caused overland Silk Road caravan trade to plummet, while oceanic maritime commerce rose to dominance because quarantine protocols could be enforced at ports. Agrarian feudal economies declined, while urban handicraft workshops expanded rapidly during severe labor shortages. Abandoned farmland entered the property market and became purchasable by common citizens. Labor scarcity drove inflation across all commodities and services. Royal treasuries lost their primary source of tax revenue from depopulated rural manors, forcing monarchs to revise taxation policies and levy duties on urban merchants and wealthy business elites instead. The plague also inflicted severe internal damage upon the Mongol Empire itself. Repeated outbreaks disrupted the Yam relay postal system, reduced nomadic herding populations, and depleted military manpower. The Golden Horde, the Yuan dynasty, and other Mongol khanates gradually lost their centralized administrative control, and the unified Mongol realm fragmented and declined in the late 14th century. The imperial network that had first opened intercontinental routes and unleashed the plague was ultimately eroded and dismantled by the long-term impacts of the pandemic it had facilitated. Class inequality widened to an extreme degree during the crisis. Affluent elites fled infected cities with stockpiled provisions to isolated countryside villas, abandoning impoverished slum dwellers who lacked financial means or the mobility to escape overcrowded, contaminated neighborhoods. This stark survival divide between rich and poor repeated itself in every subsequent major global public health emergency. The village of Ayam in England provides a powerful case study dating to 1665, when a consignment of plague-contaminated cloth imported via Eurasian trade routes brought the disease into the small settlement. The village rector William Mompesson persuaded all residents to enforce a complete voluntary lockdown, prohibiting anyone from crossing the village boundary and organizing shared food distribution to prevent hoarding and starvation. Though 2/3 of Ayam's population perished, the collective sacrifice successfully blocked the plague from spreading into surrounding rural English parishes. This act of communal solidarity stands in sharp contrast to the selfish evacuation of wealthy Florentine elites during the 1348 outbreak, proving the ultimate harm of a pandemic is never predetermined by the pathogen alone, but shaped by resource allocation, official containment strategies, and collective social solidarity. Over the next 400 years, the Yersinia pestis strain originating from the Central Asian steppe reservoir reignited epidemics across the Middle East and North Africa and across Eastern Europe multiple times. Genetic tracing of the third global plague pandemic starting in the 1890s confirms its direct lineage linked to the original rodent disease pool mobilized by Mongol-era cross-continental movement. As globalization advances and cross-border movement of people and goods keeps accelerating, the risk of similar transboundary infectious disease outbreaks continues to multiply. Major modern international public health crises mirror core structural vulnerabilities first laid bare by the Black Death in the 14th century. Economic continuity is frequently prioritized over public health prevention. Low-income communities are trapped in dense living environments with limited access to medical care. Misinformation and xenophobia create scapegoat groups to deflect systemic failure. Competing governing bodies struggle to coordinate unified cross-border responses, and central authority credibility faces severe pressure amid widespread emergency. The most vital lesson left by this pandemic spawned from Mongol imperial globalization is not limited to medical treatment of a single bacterial disease. It compels societies to examine how governing powers distribute survival resources, how vulnerable populations can be protected, and how preemptive public health defense systems are constructed. In an interconnected global civilization, any gap in local governance has the potential to escalate into a catastrophe that may engulf the entire world. If you wish to explore more historical intersections between colonial expansion, imperial warfare, and large-scale infectious diseases, leave your preferred topics in the comment section. Subscribe to this channel for in-depth documentaries on the social history of epidemics, and share this video with audiences interested in institutional reflection and the hidden crises of human civilization.